Thank you all for sticking with us on a beautiful day in Williamsburg. I know you must be tempted to go down to the Dog Street Pub or something, but we have a wonderful last speaker lined up. Dr. Andrew Keeler, Program Head, Public Policy and Coastal Sustainability at the UNC Coastal Studies Institute and Professor at the Department of Coastal Studies at East Carolina University. Dr. Keeler served as the Senior Staff Economist for Environment at the President's Council of Economic Advisors and served on the White House climate change policy teams under both President Clinton and President Bush. And he's going to end the day with a bang for us because he has some thoughtful observations and some provocative suggestions for us about our long-term responses to the threats we've been talking about. So, Dr. Keeler, thank you.
Thanks. First, as Don did, I would like to correct an error I made. The Coastal Studies Institute is now no longer the UNC Coastal Studies Institute. It is the Coastal Studies Institute, a multi-institutional partner. So I only say that in case anybody from the UNC system ever watches this video. Mainly, I'd really like to thank David and Ann and Elizabeth for organizing this. I'd really like to thank all of the previous speakers. I don't know about you guys, but I know a lot more about local government disaster finance than I did 6 hours ago. So even if you don't get anything out of my talk, I've gotten a lot out of being here, and I appreciate it. My talk is a little bit different. I have worked in the public sector, but at this point I have the luxury of being a useless academic. So I spend my time thinking about and modeling adaptation in the long term and how the short term links with the long term. So I'm going to start out talking about two different ways of thinking about resilience, which I think are really key and which underpin a lot of the discussion in ways I think are important, because they're really different. And the first one is the one that I think most of us typically think about, which is resilience is if you perturb a system, how does it bounce back? And what we want it to do is we want it to bounce back to kind of where we were before. And pretty much everything we've heard about today is when we have a perturbation caused by climate, whether it's flooding or storms or wind, how do we get our communities back to where they were so that we all can continue to live happy and productive lives on the coast? And I'm a coastal resident and have no intention to change that. But there's a second definition which has now come into more common use as we understand that that first definition may not really work for adaptation in the long run, which is the ability to recover or adjust easily to misfortune or change, or how to come up with something that's a better outcome. So what I'm going to talk about first is sort of 4 unfortunate truths about our situation on the coast, or at least unfortunate truths as I see them. How this kind of leads into some public policy principles that can affect finance. And then you guys get to be the guinea pig for a sort of policy idea or policy direction to deal with long-term transitions at the coast that I think has some attractive characteristics. So I'm looking forward to feedback, insults, and I would say thrown vegetables, but I see everybody's already gotten rid of their lunch. And that proposal is sort of called Buyouts with Rent Backs, which is not a great title, so if anybody has any suggestions, we'll go there. The first observation I'd like to make is we're buying time here at the coast. We're not crafting permanent solutions. Okay? And this is not a criticism. Buying time is, it's the most valuable thing you can buy. I'm not in any way suggesting we should not be spending money to protect ourselves, to come back to more habitable solutions after disasters. We shouldn't be nourishing beaches. All those things can be good uses of money, but they're not going to last forever unless we're unbelievably lucky and science is unbelievably wrong. Sometimes, with great uncertainty, in the next 30 to 250 years, a huge amount of coastal property is simply not going to be habitable given a level of risk that we're willing to put up with and a level of expense we can stand. So sometime in that, for some significant period of time, we're going to be able to stay at the coast and protect ourselves, and then we're going to have to leave. And what that leaving looks like, what that transition is something very different than we've ever seen before. As we've heard earlier, 46% of the American people live in a coastal county. We have orders of magnitude more people than we've seen in previous climate migrations in previous centuries and earlier in this one. We're going to have much bigger environmental problems from abandonment, septic tanks, metals, chemicals left behind when we have to abandon property. And we also have the luxury of foresight, right? We're all here kind of thinking about this. If this was a century or two ago, we would have no clue what was coming, but thanks to science, we do. It's actually climatologists' fault. So we actually can think about this, even if it's very hard to do something about it. So that's the first unfortunate truth, which nobody wants to hear, including me, but I think it's true, is we're buying time here, right? So when we think about all these solutions that we've heard such creative ways to finance, we need to remember that as important as these are, they're not going to last forever. At some point, there's going to be massive demographic transition to inland and higher areas. Okay. The second thing I think is important, especially for parts of the planning community, is that the choices about relocation and outmigration are going to be made by individuals and businesses. And they're not going to happen in a neat and easy way. There's conversations about how do we get people to move in a certain way. I think given American property rights law and our political traditions, that's not what's going to happen. Some people left last year. Some people will wash away with their houses and be happy to drown when they go into the ocean. And the rest of us are going to be somewhere in between and are going to leave based on a lot of social, economic, and risk signals that are very hard to predict, that have huge amounts of complexity in them. Retreat, as the term goes, is really unlikely to take place in a way that public policy directly dictates. Public policy is going to be really important in setting incentives and triggers. There's all kinds of levers that public policy and market signals have. But ultimately, it's individuals that are going to respond to those market signals and the public policy signals and make decisions to leave. So the third unfortunate truth is that the transition is critical, that when we're thinking about so many people at some point, and again, very likely we're not talking about us, we're talking about other generations, although for some of us it could be us if we're really unlucky with ice sheet dynamics. There's all kinds of ways we can think about what the nature of that transition looks like. Are we going to be able to retain our social and cultural capital? People care a lot about coastal communities because of their history, their recreational and social bonds, their family bonds. Can we retain that in any way? The economic cost, what is the magnitude of stranded assets that are left behind when we have to leave? The adjustments to local government finance and services, we've heard people talk about that. Is there going to be a kind of gradual disinvestment in a way that makes sense, or is it going to be like everybody's gone next week and towns are thinking about what the hell happened and how can we actually keep things going? The environmental and economic costs caused by damaged capital. We've heard about how expensive it is in Hoboken in particular, just to deal with the storm debris that's left after a major storm. Think about what it takes to sort of, Norfolk or Charleston, everything that's there in that built environment. If it has to be remediated, septic tanks, metals, everything else, that is huge. And then there's the essentially human costs. How painful and dangerous is it going to be for people to relocate? We don't really understand what even the evaluation parameters are, although I'm pretty sure that it's better if it happens gradually than rather if like 7 or 8 million people all pick up and go inland at once. I mean, it would be a terrific strain on the highway system if nothing else. And then the fourth unfortunate truth, and this is sort of a more complex one, and it's one that my colleagues and I think is really important and we're kind of into, but it feeds into my policy suggestion, is all of these risk-reducing investments that we're talking about, beach nourishment, shoreline hardening, even improved infrastructure, public money for raising houses, all of these things give market signals that increased investment in the built environment, right? And again, I'm not saying this is wrong or bad. It certainly makes economic sense over some time period. But when we do that, there's a reaction in the market that causes private capital to come in and put more money into the built environment. So the next time we're ready for another round of risk-reducing interventions, there's more value in that built environment and you have some spiral. And both intuitively and when we formally model this, what tends to happen is when you have this spiral, people stay longer, the crash is harder, you have a bigger loss of capital, and in many ways worse outcomes. So here's an example of that. The upper panel is Nags Head, North Carolina, which has nourished its beach in 2011, 2012. The lower panel is about 12 miles north in Kitty Hawk, just random transects. In 2017, I went and sort of looked at these transects and took pictures for an article we were writing, and you can see that the houses in Nags Head were all well maintained. They had lots of beach in front of them. The houses in Kitty Hawk were those houses that we've all seen where the pylons were below the high tide line, the septic tanks were starting to be exposed, the roof panels were coming off, they hadn't been painted, the HVAC systems were rusted out, and they were still being rented out weekly, and owners were thinking, okay, we'll just keep it going as long as we can. Then Kitty Hawk decided to do a nourishment project, and when I went back in late 2018, the beach was much further out. The pylons were no longer in the water. They now had a beach that was about as wide as Nag's Head, and 9 out of 10 of those houses had had significant work done to them where investment had come in and put in new HVAC systems, paint, and roofs. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. Is it's really hard to compare those outcomes, but if Kitty Hawk had not nourished, those houses would sometime in the next 4 or 5 years cease to be habitable, would have been condemned, people would have left, and you would have had a sort of more gradual and more predictable transition than we're going to have. So those are the unfortunate truths that I think we're dealing with, which is we're buying time. We need to realize that. We are not going to be able to tell people when to leave. They're going to decide. We just have some levers that affect what they do. The transition is really important, and we don't understand it very well. And there's this, what my physics colleagues call a positive feedback, that the more we invest in protection, the more we invest in property, and you get this spiral until finally it breaks as the risk accelerates high enough. Few public policy principles, they're all reasonably obvious. One is, as an economist, make the market tell the truth. Don't subsidize individual risk reduction. Don't subsidize local infrastructure, protective infrastructure. Don't subsidize insurance. Don't put a huge amount of money into post-storm aid that focuses on rebuilding back to the status quo. Recognize this is both technically and, of course, politically really difficult, but it's a pretty standard principle. If people in communities feel like the right thing to do is for them to rebuild, then they should bear the cost themselves. I recognize this goes against a huge amount of the conversation we've heard today, where people are focused on getting funding streams for building this kind of infrastructure. I understand that. As a coastal resident and taxpayer, I'm totally with you. But in thinking about the long-term dynamics of the system, this is really putting some unhelpful things in motion, I believe. So the second principle, which goes along with that, is I'm not in any way saying that there should not be a transfer of resources to people at risk in coastal areas. I think to the greatest extent possible, those resources should be given in a way that don't bias people toward rebuilding in place. They should be neutral so that if people feel like what they want to do is use those resources and relocate to a less risky area, we should not be encouraging them not to by the way that aid is structured. Third principle, and it's one of the reasons I was actually so delighted to be here, is because I learned a lot about tying things to particular triggers and about the way it's being used so creatively in short-term processes. Is I think there's a huge advantage in allowing markets to adjust in a sensible way by setting signals on how we do protective engineering on some observable signals. So I live on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Every so often we rebuild the Bonner Bridge. There's lots of ways we could say how long are we going to rebuild it. Probably the best way to do it, rather than say 40 years or something like that, because we really don't know how the risks are going to proceed, because we have so little direct knowledge about on the ground how quickly climate is going to affect individual localities, to say, okay, we're going to continue to rebuild the Bonner Bridge, but we're not going to rebuild it after we see sea level at a certain gauge here, or after we see 3 Cat 3 or higher storms within a 10-year period. Something that everybody can observe that's publicly available. Like the triggers for the parametric insurance or other instruments that we talked about. The problem here is the commitment comes from government. Private contracts can make this and it can be enforceable. We all know that a government commitment to do something 30 years in the future is virtually impossible to enforce. It can be politically turned. So while I think this is a really good idea, I have no idea how you arrange it politically, but I do think it would really help in sending the right signals to private markets in making these adjustments. And finally, as we've heard from earlier speakers, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Storms and floods that cause extensive property damage disrupt the costs and benefits of discontinuous change, right? Before the storm, I have a benefit to staying in my house and a benefit to leaving. After the storm, the benefit to staying in my house is way lower because it has a huge amount of damage. The benefit to leaving stays the same. Human nature and policy history have showed us that we are biased toward, we're not giving into nature, we're rebuilding. This is a really admirable characteristic. I think we Americans have it more than almost anybody else. We're not giving in, we're going to keep I appreciate it, but I think it's really maladaptive. And I think that a big part of letting people make good decisions about adaptation as it goes from do we stay or do we go involves changing the conversation and expectations about disaster response and resilience so that relocation is seen as a possible option, and I would say not even a possible option, but one that at some point in the future our community is going to have to deal with. Maybe not us, but our community will. So the resulting issues for finance in the longer run that result from all this are, the big question is, when is buying time worth it, right? It's a hard question, but we do need to ask it. Buying time is worth it right now, I think clearly, but at some point it's not going to be. And it's a very complex calculation trying to understand that, but it's one we have to do to make good decisions. Second, I think the specifics of a major transition matter a lot, whether it's gradual versus sudden, what's the value of lost capital, what's the level of social disruption. If we believe, and I think most of us do believe that sometime in the next 300 years, these coastal communities are not going to be viable. And that could be as early as 35 to 50 years if we're really unlucky. Then we really need to start thinking about how this transition happens, because there's a lot of ways that it can happen that are going to be devastating in terms of human impacts and economic losses. And then finally, this third principle based on our sort of positive feedback is we need to be aware that using public resources to reduce short-term impacts can have negative unintended effects on transition dynamics, right? We can really be stretching things out more as people take these investments as a signal that says, oh, this is going to continue to happen, so it's safe to continue to invest in the way we have in the past, and therefore you end up with this sort of vicious spiral. So those are the unfortunate truths and the principles, and now I'm going to subject you to my harebrained policy idea that I think has at least some attractive characteristics to help us negotiate this long-term transition that I'm positing that we're all going to have to deal with, although I'm not seeing a lot of nodding heads out there. So, okay. I'm calling the proposal, very uncreatively, buyouts with rent backs, and I'm going to talk about what the proposal is, what the problems that it can potentially solve or ameliorate, some of the drawbacks and challenges, and what the next steps would be. I want to be clear. One, I don't think this is a perfect policy. I don't think there is a perfect policy, but this one clearly is not perfect. Secondly, what you're going to see is sort of a sketch rather than a perfectly thought out. We haven't even modeled this rigorously yet. But with that, what the heck? Let's go ahead. So what's the policy? The policy is that at some point in the future, some public or regulated private entity, it could be a pool of private capital, is going to buy properties, and those properties will be bought with partial public funding, and then they're going to they'll rent those properties back to the seller. So if I own a house, I can sell that house to a public authority or a pool of private capital, and part of the contract will be that I am allowed to live in that house and pay a specified amount of rent for a period of time. Okay. At some point, that rental agreement is going to end, and I'm going to have to move, and the property at some point will be retired, and at that point, remediation or salvage of materials that can be used productively elsewhere will take place. So that's the sketch of the policy. Where does the money come, and what's the price? One advantage of this program in terms of finance is you have this pool of rents, right? So if it's a public authority or a pool of private capital, in addition to traditional sources of buyout funds, which so far are pretty much, right, just FEMA and a few specialized programs, then you say, okay, we at least have some expectation of these future rents. Will you have the present discounted value, and that goes into our calculation of what we're willing to pay for the property. Right now, almost all buyouts come from repetitive loss properties that are going to be retired. This is a different model where we're buying houses that still have useful life left on them, and they're not going to be immediately destroyed. It happens earlier in the risk path, and it's designed around community transition, not individual properties, so it's different. So that's one source of funds. Then there's general sources of compensation to public to put coastal residents. There's the existing sources of buyout funds. There's resources that are going to climate-proof individual properties like better roofs, resources for risk reduction at the community and regional levels, protecting property, protecting infrastructure, the money, the millions of dollars NAG's had spent in 2012 and is spending again this summer on beach nourishment, and potential savings from remediation after abandonment if there are indeed economies of scale and scope in dealing with remediating large numbers of properties together rather than trying to hold individuals responsible for their own remediation. And again, I'm not shortchanging the difficulties of pooling these kinds of finance, but I do think that once you make the adjustment to saying, okay, we're in a period of transition and disinvestment, and so what we're after here is a way for people to be able to move away and not protect this anymore, then it at least is theoretically possible to take these diverse groups of funds as well as the future rents and move them into a line of funding that can finance this policy. Okay. What's the price? I don't have an answer for that one, right? I mean, you've got the present discounted value of rent less expenses. The other sources I talked about, there can be general transfers from the government. You could structure it so that you minimized people's upfront rental costs by lowering the price that you paid them but giving them a certain amount of free rent. It's going to be influenced by real estate fundamentals. I'll just repeat that existing buyouts usually occur when the property has been repeatedly damaged by climate events and they buy out at some version of pre-disaster market value. We're talking about a very different model, and it's not clear what that price would be. I do think, though, that as we hit that the point where that transition happens is, in all likelihood, going to be a point where the real estate market starts to internalize the fact that risks are rising and that coastal real estate is not a great long-term investment at its current price, and that there's likely to be some price where significant transactions will take place. But hopefully in a couple of years I'll have a better answer for that. Okay. So again, policy, the residents, whether the owners or current renters, continue to reside in their property if they wish to. They can leave any time with proper notice, and then there have to be rules and decisions for when the property is no longer rented. Big question is who owns the houses after buyout. I can think of sort of two pretty easy models. One is local government with a public housing model. We have a lot of public housing in the US where public entities manage real estate, typically not single-family houses in coastal areas, but still the model is there. And then I think it's plausible that a pool of private capital that will be far less risk-averse than individual renters could see this under the right circumstances and as an attractive opportunity if the numbers worked out. Who manages the properties after buyout? That's a separate question. Could be local government, which manages public housing. Could be contracts with management companies. That would be politically feasible in coastal areas where you've got a lot of real estate interests that would see this as a disaster but can at least see some transition path by making money by managing it. There could be all kinds of mixed models. When does it start? Again, no great answer. It definitely starts earlier in the risk calculation than existing buyout programs. The start's got to be determined in conjunction with what the end date of the program is, what your target is for when the community is, or the part of the community is no longer viable. It's going to be determined by some combination of observable climate signals, modeling, and of course, experience and muddling through. So when does it end? It's some combination of, if the tenant stays for a certain period of time, it ends when the tenant leaves, and then the house is decommissioned and salvaged and remediated. It could be when the house is damaged to some pre-specified level. My personal favorite is, as we learned so much about earlier, is you tie it to some transparent observable signal. Or some risk mitigation signal, like when we have to nourish more than every 2 years in order to keep a certain beach width going. And when you observe that, that's a signal that it's over, right? And so, again, you have the program start, and then at some point in time, the program ends. And in between, people can stay, but they don't have to leave at one time, and you've separated the financial and wealth decision of the individual homeowner from when they have to leave. So there's kind of two sets of advantages to this program. One set of advantages has generally to do with buyouts, and this program I think is useful because it makes buyouts much more politically and economically feasible. And then there's some other, a couple of other advantages that I think are kind of unique to this program. And so I'll talk about those and then mercifully conclude. Buyouts are a mechanism for relatively neutral financial transfers. Okay. which again, as an economist, I believe is important. I think that if it is worth it for people to remain in coastal areas, then at some point, the financial responsibility for dealing with that risk has to stay with local people. If not, then you are really stretching the timeline, and I believe encouraging communities to delay adaptation and with significant likelihood make the outcomes worse for large swaths of the population. Okay. Historical means, post-disaster assistance, subsidies to engineering and infrastructure, insurance subsidies, all tend to be biased against relocation. Buyouts prevent a means of transferring resources in a way that don't bias people towards staying, and in the case of this program, the buyouts with rentbacks don't bias people toward leaving all at the same time. And I think that's important. I think we don't want an outcome where, there's a storm and everybody picks up and leaves the next day. Okay. Buyouts could serve as a mechanism for aggregating diverse sources of finance. That's kind of a fantasy that requires a lot more innovation in public sector and private sector institutions than we have, but it's in the future. We're seeing some really interesting experiments now we've heard about today, and I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think a big advantage of a large buyout program with this timeline is thinking about remediation, which we haven't done, but we all know that even in the limited cases where people have abandoned coastal properties and just left, towns have an almost impossible job going after people, getting them to take responsibility for their septic tanks and salvage and remediation. If you think about that on a large scale, there's huge advantages in having that responsibility be transferred either to a government entity or to a centralized pool of capital that has both management capacity, but also can put up performance bonds and can be held financially liable for not doing it. Buyouts could price remediation into buyout pricing, but I think that there are significant economies of scale and timing in having one entity be broadly responsible for remediating damage, deconstructing houses, and getting the salvage value out of appliances and materials that could be used to provide useful inputs to construction projects in other parts of the country. So buyouts add a longer time horizon and a more predictable flow of properties to be abandoned, potentially enhancing these efficiencies in remediation and salvageable. Okay. And again, I think just the fact that you have this flow of rents providing an additional source of finance at least potentially makes this a much more feasible policy than it would be if buyouts had to come from the traditional sources where, let's face it, so far there hasn't been that much money, and we're looking at such a large problem that even if with significant increases in funding, it's going to get stretched pretty thin. And then I think the flexibility and timing makes homeowners more likely to accept buyouts, right? If it's like, if I've got to take the buyout now and leave, that's different than if I can take the buyout and wait till my kid finishes high school, or until I finish this job, or until I can sort of think of a business opportunity or retrain myself for something somewhere else. So moving the timeline forward from everything is already trashed makes buyouts more generally effective, I think, in managing transitions. Here's a couple of things that I think are specific to this sort of rent-back policy that, at least to me, are potentially really important. I talked about that positive feedback where we protect ourselves by beach nourishment or raising infrastructure, so we invest more in the private market and property, so then there's more of a political economy case to continue to invest on the public side, which cycles back to more investment until there's a crash. If the same entity is both owning and managing property and making decisions about spending public money on reducing risk, then you've centralized that decision. Then you're making that decision jointly, which doesn't guarantee it will be perfect, but it does get rid of that sequential feedback where you're simultaneously saying, okay, given what I have in terms of property and how much it's going to cost me to nourish the beach or keep raising my road, what's my best path out of here? And it removes one source of uncertainty from relocation and reduces crash risk. So at least to me, as a way of at least partially breaking that positive feedback cycle, I think it creates a significant probability of a much better glide path towards significant relocation when and if, but in my opinion, when that eventually has to happen. I think another big advantage is separating financial decisions and considerations from relocation decisions, at least to some extent, right? As real estate markets start to increasingly price in risk when it sort of looks like the risks are getting really high, Resident owners may feel trapped by a loss of wealth and feel like, I can't possibly sell. We know behaviorally in falling real estate markets, people will hang on to their property because they're sure it will come back, or they can't stand to lose wealth. The ability to kind of get out of that and look at relocation separately from that financial decision is important. People may feel pressure to sell early and get out to try to time the market before there's a reverse speculative bubble. That could happen too. Behaviorally, it's really hard to predict. It's certainly true that individual property owners are going to be, by and large, much more risk averse than either the public sector or private pools of centralized capital. So I think the second big advantage of the rent-back policy is by separating the relocation decision temporarily from the decision to sell your property, you make it much more possible for people to make reasoned decisions that let them make easier transitions. You also have a more definite and predictable glide path for local government finance as sort of communities have to spin down their services and what they do. And so, again, I think you increase the risk of, increase the probability of better outcomes there. So decision points increasingly come after climate events with clumping of relocation, with everybody sort of leaving at once if that's what's going to happen. Financial hardship makes successful relocation problematic. So buyouts with rentbacks separates the wealth decision and fear of loss from the relocation decision. I think just anything that smooths that transition and keeps what I'm calling, maybe not very descriptively, clumping from happening, keeps, lots of people leaving at a same time as it's like, my house isn't worth anything anymore, I got to get the hell out, it's not worth rebuilding. It allows getting rid of those spikes in relocation allows short-term and residential rentals to support tourism. You can have, again, more of a glide path out. Rentals can either stand in or in case of public ownership, rentals will provide income. In case of private ownership, you'd still have property tax receipts. So the possibility of really sharp, sudden spikes, or excuse me, reverse spikes of drops in local government finance from tax receipts will at least be smoothed and made more predictable to some extent, which, if and when we get to this very unfortunate circumstance, is going to allow for a much more plausible transition for the public sector that is required to provide basic services, but can only do so if it has finance to do it. Okay, so that's the basic proposal. Those are what I think a lot of the advantages are. I recognize there's huge amounts of difficulty, and also it's hard to talk about a policy where we're not there yet. I do think it's really important to start thinking about this long-term transition now, because we're going to get there. And there's, in my very humble and pretty uninformed climatic opinion, the probability of really discontinuous increases in sea level rise due to ice sheet dynamics are no longer as close to zero as we would like them to be. I think we're still looking at low probability events, but I don't think we're looking at black swan events anymore. Drawbacks and challenges, the inherent difficulty of public ownership of anything, right? There's a lot of sort of concern and cynicism about having the public sector directly involved in managing economic activity. There's certainly policy and political difficulties in aggregating diverse sources of finance funds from future rental receipts that have to be governed by complex contracts, to local government funds that are used for protection, to FEMA funds that are used for insurance and other things, and that's not an easy thing to get done. Whenever you have a policy like this that depends on payouts under certain circumstances, you have to be worrying about people gaming the system, corrupt outcomes where people figure out, possibly like how to come out and, buy a property or put something up in a way where they can take advantage of the buyout. I'm not sure this is even important, but you may have holdouts and people that just don't want to sell. That can happen anyway, so is there any degree of coercion and eminent domain in here? This is a partial list. Believe me, there's plenty of things to work out here. Next steps, if this idea has any value at all, I think we need to really start thinking about identifying the triggers for when these buyouts should occur. We need to explore the feasibility of private investment as a means of implementation and rental management. And I think the most important is we really, through a combination of qualitative and quantitative social science research and modeling, need to start getting some understanding of how coastal populations might react to a program like this, depending on timing, price, contract terms, rental price and parameters, the optics of the program, all these other implementation parameters. Even as we've seen from Don's talk, just putting a better roof on a house is incredibly complex. A policy like this obviously is going to be orders of magnitude more complex. But in conclusion, I still think it's worth thinking about and worth considering. It's an imperfect policy. I can't think of a better one. At least I haven't thought of a better one yet. If our analysis about the importance of transition from climate proofing to relocation is correct, then lots of outcomes with really bad characteristics become possible. Mass relocation on short time scales, significant loss of wealth and social capital in coastal communities, crashes with large capital losses. This policy, or something with similar features, has at least the possibility to ameliorate some of these really bad characteristics of mass relocation. And for that reason, I think that something like this is at least worthy of putting in the back of our minds and thinking about as we go forward. Again, please do not take my presentation here as an argument that we should not be funding resilience or protecting ourselves against coastal risks. I think in the short run, it's absolutely a sensible economic thing to do. But I also think at some point it's not going to be a sensible thing to economic thing to do. And understanding when we go from the first to the second is really hard. And when we get there, we're going to be in a lot better shape if we thought about how to do it and what it's going to look like. So thanks very much.
All right, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Mark does, Dr. Luckenbach.
Very interesting. You talked about this almost entirely from the perspective and use homeowner and housing. Mm-hmm. What additional complexities get added to this with commercial real estate?
Lots, but I'm looking forward to somebody figuring that out. I guess there's not any particular reason why the real property aspects of those things could not be included in this program. But as we know, the bigger economic value is sort of the going concern, the institutional value of an ongoing economic enterprise. Some of that is human capital that can be transferred to other places if the physical capital can be recovered. But I'm not minimizing the difficulty. Yeah, it's a great question, and I look forward to somebody smarter than me coming up with the answer.
Thanks, Andy. It's provocative thoughts. Appreciate that. Have you been thinking at all about geographic scale of the application of this policy? Is this sort of the entire coastal zone is in or out, or could you envision a municipality prioritizing certain parts of a community that will be most vulnerable first, and there's a way of transitioning out of those smaller scale places using some of these tools?
So one of the things that I do believe is that there's an enormous amount of heterogeneity on the eastern Gulf coasts, not just in terms of what the built environment looks like and what the climatic risks are, but what the degrees of wealth and social capital are and the ability to withstand different kinds of risks. So my hope and expectation would be that these programs would start and end at different times. We're not looking at sort of a mass national program, but the triggers that we would develop that said, hey, it's time to start this, will be different from place to place. This has a lot of advantages. One, it sort of spreads out the financing and institutional structure that has to go into it. It also gives us the ability to do policy experiments and see what works and what doesn't in a few early cases. So at least in my primitive conception of it, it is pretty geographically diverse, unless we're in some weird world where, sea level rises so fast and so discontinuously that something has to happen, in which case we've got much bigger problems. So again, I think it's a really critical point, and I think the way it would work best is in a kind of much more gradual and geographically heterogeneous way.
Anyone else? Thank you. Okay, so it's a lovely day in beautiful Williamsburg, Virginia. Sunny. Thanks to Andy, we're ending early. You got tiramisu for dessert. It's hard to beat a day like that. Please join me in thanking our sponsor, our partners, our speakers. They did a lovely job today. Thank you. So this was the first time, as many of you all know, that we've done a spring forum, and we loved doing it, and we hope that this is followed up by other events. We will hold our annual fall conference that we do every year in November. This year it's November 15th, and our wonderful partners, VIMS and Virginia Sea Grant and the Virginia Environmental Endowment will help us in doing that again this year. And we're hoping to do it as a follow-up to this. This is cracking the door on these issues. There's so much more to explore. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall. Have a great day.